Radio 4.
Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Can you imagine anything more terrifying than having to land a plane, never having flown one before, with the pilot dead beside you? A gothic horror story, a nightmare, and then back on the ground you realise it was all for real. It had actually been happening, and like the young man it did happen to, you can't stop shaking for a week. Well, here's Sarah Harrison, Nicholas Tucker, Edwin Blishen, and Matthew Parris. What was their most frightening experience?
The strange thing about these, as you say, is the incredible brilliance. They're probably the most real things that ever happened to you. The brilliance, the vividness with which they stay in the memory. One of these is one of my almost earliest memories. I suppose I must have been scarcely 3, probably less, and I was standing with my back to an open fire. I can remember the smocked dress I was wearing, and our large black dog walked in front of me. For some reason, the guard wasn't there or moved, and I sat on the open fire.
God.
And I can see now, I can have the image in my mind of the fireplace looking out of it.
I can feel it as you tell me.
The skirt, and my mother leaning forward to grab me out.
You have terrible scars on your bottom.
Yeah, I bet you'd love to know. I was on
Do try and be serious,
weeks.
Matthew.
It was terrifying.
Yes, well, I don't drive. And once, actually, I found myself at the wheel, that's the round thing, you hold,
Is that so?
of a lorry on a hill alone.
You hadn't been drinking.
No.
then.
The actual, you will hardly believe what led up to it. I got into this lorry, and I was a lorry driver's mate at the time, and the man I was lorry driver's mate to said, see what it's like. Sit there. So I sat there in my mild, acquiescent way. He then turned the thing on and said, see what it sounds like, feels like, and so on. It began to throb and vibrate and so on. I felt terribly pleased and would, if he had not been there, have made those noises, like boom, 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 that sort of thing. And then he left me. And I realised he'd taken the brake off and I was going downhill. And I was entirely and absolutely alone. And somehow or other, some atavistic memory of driving, probably from my ancestors hundreds of years ago, prevailed. And I don't know to this day how I stopped it, but I managed to stop this thing just before it reached the bottom of the hill. But I have no idea.
You put your foot out as though it was an ox cart and dragged it along.
An AA man talked him down.
That's it. What about you, Nicholas?
Well, since Sarah mentioned her bottom, I would say that I remember the age of 3 sitting backwards. It was a very hot day, so we had no clothes on, in a clump of nettles. And perhaps there's something special about these particular pains. But the thing I do remember, very small beer compared to all yours, but is as a shy adolescent queuing up at a large youth hostel. And I'd already got the
warden. It's a
warden.
rather vivid picture.
Well, it develops. The warden was one of those jokey types, so everybody who signed on had some sort of heavy badinage, which was bad enough. So I just about got through that. And then we all had to take our tasks. Because, as you know, at youth hostels, you have to do a little job.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, you've never been to one. I seem to live
never.
in them at a certain age. And my task came out, and I read it in a casual way. I read these words: organise the community singing after supper. I can genuinely say I've never had a moment of horror like that before.
I absolutely share the feeling.
I just didn't know what to do other than just flee the camp. So I did the other sensible thing. When he wasn't looking, I put the card back and took another one, which said, clean the taps in the washroom. And I was safe. But I really do mean it. That the idea that humiliation has a horror that still gets me now.
What about Matthew?
I do wish Sarah hadn't told that story about sitting in the fire. I shall never now be able to visualise her without picturing the horrifyingly scarred bottom that I shall undoubtedly never see.
Why is it making you giggle? Yes, see what I mean?
Wouldn't it make you giggle?
What a rotter.
But I think that all the other stories so far indicate the real nature of true horror, which is not just seeing something very frightening. true horror is when you're in control yourself, or supposed to be in control, and something is going terrifyingly wrong. I made my first public speech at the Cambridge Union. I decided it was time for a maiden speech. Young undergraduate, got up. I stood at the lectern, or whatever it was. I'd learnt my speech by heart because I wanted to make a great impression on everybody. It was a short speech, but very much to the point, and it had 5 sentences. And I reached the end of the 3rd sentence, and I realised that I couldn't remember what the 4th sentence was going to be. And I reached the very beginning of the 4th sentence, and I realised not only that I had forgotten the 4th sentence, but that I'd forgotten what I was talking about. And I stood there for 15 seconds with my mouth open, and during that time, I forgot what the debate was about too. I was so terrified I couldn't even remember what we were discussing, and apparently I stood there for almost a minute, absolutely silently, unable to speak. And the President said perhaps Mr. Parris would like to sit down, and I went back to my rooms and determined to grow a beard and never come out till no one could recognise me
You're
again.
absolutely right, because we invent the horrific scenario. I mean, I reached out once when I was a boy in Africa doing the national service, just going to turn the knob of the bungalow door, and there was a scorpion with its tail up. All I did was snatch my hand back, and that really wasn't terribly frightening. But as you spoke, I remember a time, not a long time ago, I was sitting at it was a kind of a dinner, and it was John Arlott who was commenting on a sort of wine tasting, a doomed enterprise for sort of public consumption, and the whole evening was going from bad to worse. And I happened to be sitting next to Eric Morecambe. And as everything went worse and worse, Morecambe just leant over to me, nudged me and said, "You're on next." And then I was reminded by the community singing the other thing. I mentioned Africa, and one of the jokes that old coasters, as they used to be called, used to tell was as soon as you landed in Takoradi or Lagos, you had to make a beeline for the quartermaster's stores to get a Tetsi belt. You know, he said, if you don't get a Tetsi belt, put it on immediately, death, awful. And, of course, it was a kind of April Fool joke, because a Tetsi belt is a geographical area rather than something you put on. So it's a pretty crude joke. But it fooled everyone, as all April Fool jokes, I think, do. Now, I was perfectly prepared to believe the front page of the Times this week that Belgium was at last going to disappear, part being absorbed by France, some by Holland, and so on. Since Belgium has always been a pretty vague entity, I thought it probably all for the best. But I would have gone away convinced if I hadn't read at in the bottom line that they reminded me what the date was. But mention of the date is a cop-out. We're only pretending, it says, whereas the therapeutic value of the April Fool joke, I think, is the momentary relief it gives you from the constraints of meaning. Just for a moment, the burden of meaning is taken from your shoulders and you don't have to worry anymore. If spaghetti grows on trees and there's an Arcadian island called Sans Serif, then you have a radiant vision of nothing mattering ever again. It's a vision of freedom, don't you think? Or are you against April Fool jokes?
I mean, in a sense, as long as you can spot them, but because of all these newspaper and radio things now, every April the 1st, I read whatever paper's in front of me with a terrible sense of suspicion. And you find yourself not just getting the April Fools, but suspecting the genuine bits of news. It's really quite a dangerous thing. But I think the newspaper ones and the radio ones are sort of impersonal. It's the personal ones that are a problem. I think for a parent, your children expect you to do April Fools, and if you don't, it's a form of neglect. And yet the only April Fools that ever seem to work seem to me to have a terrible element of cruelty in them. And I once wrote a little note to my daughter, as if from the headmistress of her primary school, saying, as a special bonus, she's going to have extra maths lessons in the Easter holiday. My daughter burst into tears, and you're right, she's never forgiven me. And yet she wouldn't have forgiven me if I hadn't fooled her. That's a sort of strange double bind about the whole business.
Oh, I think it's dangerous country.
Yes, I'm afraid I think they're absolutely appalling. I do think in a way that they give a sort of license to mendaciousness, because they're all about lying, aren't they? That's what April Fools are. I mean, we must obviously exclude all practical joking from this. That's another department, in my opinion. The problem now is that I suppose you might say that it acts as a kind of safety valve, because on this one day everybody can behave so badly and lie with impunity to everybody else and say, oh, ha ha, aren't you gullible? That's another word I hate. It's just another word for trusting, for goodness sake. But I think, but now with this terrible proliferation of these programmes which actually their whole raison d'etre is leading people up the garden path, and these frightful deceits that are practiced on unsuspecting members of the public. I think the whole usefulness of the day has gone, and perhaps its only usefulness is because we're all the time now being bombarded with so much information, from papers and telly and radio, which is all highly coloured and exaggerated and angled, and in that sense only partly true. There is a kind of relief, a purity about something which is totally false, and where then somebody says, yes, this was false, and now we all know about it, and we accept it.
You leave out
kind
one
of
thing. I think that the joke has to parade its fraudulence and yet hit a bullseye. And I remember one from a Dutch newspaper called Die Telegraaf. I mean, what makes it funny is all Dutch names sound like someone who can't speak English properly, but nearly can spell it and all that. And it simply reported that the Vatican newspaper Osservatore Romano would now be carrying horoscopes. Now, that parades its fraudulence, but I never heard a better bullseye.
I think that there is a wrong and a more legitimate side of April Fool's jokes. The wrong side is just the cruelty of practical jokes of any kind. Your mother's just been eaten by a shark, person bursts into tears, ha ha, she hasn't April Fool, it isn't funny. But there is something that is funny about April Fool's jokes, and that is that they satirise the world we live in by being as believable as they are, so that when you realise that they weren't true, but they might very well have been true, you are not just laughing at the person who's been fooled, you're laughing at the state of affairs in the world, which could be so easily mimicked and appear to be so when it wasn't.
Absolutely.
Well, I think it's I think everyone's being very serious about it. I mean, it
that's
seems to
a
be,
mercy, Edward, don't knock it.
Terribly grave and solemn, because I don't know whether it began as a children's festival. I don't know if Nick knows that, but it always seems to me that essentially it's a childish thing. I mean, all those elaborate, sophisticated things about islands called sans serif and so on seem to me to be very latter-day sort of embroideries of the thing, and not really in the spirit of the thing. The spirit of the thing, to me, is still the basic, in the spirit of that basic hoax to which I was exposed 60 or 70 years ago, 80 perhaps years ago, 90 years ago. Come on. When people said, your shoelace is undone, and your shoelace was undone. Essentially, that was the actual scale of it. And I think it is, if I look back to the playground, that was the real spirit probably of All Fool's Day.
But you don't think it could be developed into something, more of an art form?
But it glanced at the notion that human beings were daft. And I think a whole day which devoted to the notion that we are daft is a rather useful
But
thing.
don't you think, wouldn't you think that instead of saying, look down, your shoelace is undone, it's better to say that Uri Geller threatens to bend the Eiffel Tower?
Well, no good saying that in
Very
1928, we wouldn't have known what you were talking about.
Well, you must have heard of the Eiffel Tower.
You go and get a pint of pigeons.
But Edward, the problem about that shoelace, I mean, as you say it, I just remember the sickening boredom of it. And I think I think they're all right to read about or hear about. I mean, you're right
Nonsense.
about the childish thing. That whenever the Beano and the Dandy came out on April the 1st, do you remember every single comic strip character did something with wet paint, or he tacked a kipper on somebody's overcoat, and it ended up with people convulsed with laughter. Now, in my life, any April Fool I've either engineered or been done on me, it's never ended with laughter. It's ended with very long, complicated explanations.
Yes, no.
People say, well, I don't understand.
Yeah.
But what gives us a wry smile about that Times piece on Belgium is not so much the joke as the fact that we're now living in a time when things like this are actually happening all the time, and it didn't have to be April the 1st that we read about something like that. And I think, in a rather mild way, that is quite funny.
Yeah.
I think it shows us what an act of faith the whole business of giving and receiving truth is anyway. I think it suddenly shows us how many willing sort of steps of belief we make every day to suit our own purposes when we're actually told something like that.
You're quite right about the world being like that, because I almost believed it when someone said the Russians had invented a plastic magnet.
Yes.
I mean, what a good idea. What a wonderful idea.
I once played a recording of some electric eels in a tank to a friend of mine, and I pretended it was modern music.
How did you get him to sit still while you did this?
It lasted about 3 minutes, and I remember my friend saying, "Oh, it's got a certain something." And I said, "No, this is modern music. This is electric eels in a tank." And I think I actually killed something.
Good. Well, you
lost a friend.
I lost it in the sense I lost a friend.
Yes.
And it's all right making the world look absurd, but it's not all right making our nearest and dearest look absurd.
Oh, I
In a
don't
way,
agree.
you get too far inside. It's embarrassing.
I must say, I enjoy the confected thing if it is properly confected, and I think one of the best was the report that the ploughman had dug up the arms of the Venus de Milo. I mean, it's easy to imagine that they've got to be somewhere. And a source at the Louvre said, they are a perfect fit. It's a very exact interference with our perception of reality. But I don't believe that reality is going to be interrupted by our friend Mervyn Stutter, who sings a song now which he calls The Story of Edwin Mins.
Well, here's the story of Edwin Mins, the man who collects the strangest of things. Not brasses or vases, he's real avant-garde. You see, Edwin collects telephone cards. Whoa, Edwin Mins, are you genuine? Tell me, how did you begin? Tell me, Edwin Mins. Well, thank you very much. Now, I was latterly into philately, actually. But I used to find stamp hinges far too fiddly. Then this German bloke wanted English telephone cards and offered to exchange them for my stamps. So I went out and picked up 100 telephone cards from the floors of phone boxes and swapped them for 2,000 stamps. I then decided to start collecting them myself, and it just sort of snowballed from there, really. Oh, Edwin Mins, that's really interesting. You're truly riveting. Go on, Edwin Mins. Well, thank you very much. Now, there's Caribbean cards overprinted with butterflies, orchids and coconut palms, and Mercury cards overprinted with elephants, parrots, steam trains, Madonna, the Beatles and Liverpool football team. Now, we don't get particularly excited by the actual designs. We prefer to examine the little notches. Buenos notches, we call them. No, we don't. That's just my little joke. Now, the notches are small indentations on the right edge designed to indicate to people which way to insert the card in the dark. Some notches are placed in the wrong position, usually at the bottom left. This makes it very exciting. Oh, Edwin Mins, you can't be genuine. Are you on mescaline? Are you Edwin Mins? Well, forgers have been known to deepen the notches, but luckily it's pretty easy to detect, actually. And sometimes the notch looks as if it is missing altogether. And if that weren't enough, the plasticizers in your PVC album can sometimes alter the colour of your phone cards. Yes, so you can see that what began as a hobby has now become a full-time enterprise, which I coordinate from my East London bedsit. My Bible is a booklet entitled Collect British and Irish Telephone Cards by the undisputed telephone card king, S.E.R. Hiscox. This is a crucial collector's tome by S.E.R. Hiscox. I also travel regularly to Belgium. No, Edwin Mins. Okay, I give in. Pass me that bottle of gin and the rest of the aspirins. No, Edwin Mins. Run me through with a javelin. Okay, you win. It's fascinating, Edwin Mins. Oh, thank you very much.
There, we had Edwin Mins by Mervyn Stutter. But there you have it. The real world continuously overtakes the humorists. Perelman said of a film star that his library featured, quote, the cream of the world's great abridgments. But even he couldn't have thought that there existed anyone so crass that they'd collect empty crisp packets.
Right.
Yet Miller's price guide to what they describe as collectibles, stuff you might otherwise call rubbish if people weren't prepared to pay for it, says crisp packets are the thing to get in on the ground floor of. Looking round the table, I can't imagine any of us setting aside Saturday evening to sort through our crisp packets. Hard to imagine Sarah ringing me up and saying, it's the bag lady here. I'm willing to swap a 1970 overprinted Golden Wonder for a First State Smith's with the salt packet wrongly printed in green. But crisp packets are just the absurd extreme. I have a feeling there's something odd about collecting anyway. The instinct to hoard, pile up, accumulate? Do any of you do it?
Well, it's funny you should mention the bags, because I think there are different reasons for collecting, aren't there? There's sheer idleness. There's the things which just stick to you rather than the other way round. There's the dog in the manger, where it's, and I think this is a very interesting aspect of it, where people simply want to own more of those particular things so that other people can't have them. You only have to watch people sort of going around sales and junk shops. It's a terribly sort of anally retentive activity. And the other one is the positive sort of collector who says, I must have these Edwardian thimbles or whatever they are. I think what bothers me about all collecting is that it completely fails to value the separate and individual. Quite. The collection is everything. And this is why I sort of feel if you're going to collect china, frogs, or... Funny how frogs, pigs and owls are very popular, but you really have to, or the person concerned has to have more than about 12. Then they can produce them, no matter how naff and appalling the individual pigs, frogs or owls, once you've got 12 or more, it's a collection, it somehow becomes respectable.
You're quite right.
Deeply
the
depressing.
Collection itself gets in the way of the individual article.
Absolutely,
quite
yeah.
right. Edward?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. What seems to me interesting at the moment is that this sort of nostalgic ephemera, actually almost like the crisp packets. So almost anything can be turned. If you begin to collect it, you can start a desire to collect that particular nonsense anywhere, I think. So...
Do you do it at all?
No. I remember not long ago entering a house where they collected tins. And I must admit, there was a moment or two when my heart fluttered, because there was an ancient Oxo tin, about 1926 or 1927. But I pulled myself together and said to myself what I believe to be absolutely true, that a house in which the sideboard is covered with shabby tins is really a nasty house. I don't want to live with a lot of shabby tins. And it seems to me more and more people are living with shabby tins.
Oh dear,
But
shabby
can,
tin.
can I just take you up on this crisp packet thing? I think, dare I say, you slightly misunderstood it. Because in the page in this book we've all been reading, collectibles, given over to crisp packets, he displays them all. Then he says, these have no value. But, he adds on, it'd be a good thing if people did collect crisp packets, because it'd be very good for the
You
environment.
didn't read the handout tucked into the book where it said, in a few years' time,
say
our golden wonder crisp packet might be worth 20 quid.
The point I'm making, you see, is
We
that
must put all the facts before the jury,
I don't agree
Nick.
with Edward. I think this chap is trying to start a collection, and the whole
Yes.
business of collecting is it is utterly illogical.
Yes.
And so suddenly, if somebody wants to collect enema pumps or humane cattle killers, it might suddenly take off, but it has nothing to do with the environment or common sense.
No, it
it's
might.
turning the acquisitive society totally on its head. It's buying the things that have no interest or value to anybody else.
It might well take off, but the interesting question is why might it take off? Why might you want to collect those things? It's plainly a form of mental illness. It's a mild, harmless form of mental illness. It's a totally irrational activity, which appears to be done to satisfy some sort of, or soothe something in ourselves, but which serves no practical purpose at all. What I wonder is, given that most forms of personality disorder and mentally disordered behaviour
Right.
are the perversions of some sort of an instinct which at one time has been useful to us as animals, but now has been canalised or turned sideways, perverted in some way into something that is useless. What useful human instinct that once served us well is this strange desire to
Well,
collect things?
could
a
I
perversion of?
suggest that the possibility is that it gives you what you can't get elsewhere, namely completeness. An artificial situation like a collection can be complete. I saw just recently the word completist used of a collector who wanted everything in the category that he collected. Now, you see, there's nothing in life that is ever complete except death, and you can do it with a collection. I don't say it's very useful to do it, but it gives you a holiday from the incompleteness, which is everything.
It must be said, of course, that the word... Sir John collected, and he had a collection. It became the British Museum. So I don't know whether that is a valuable... Whether this is what Matthew's at. Was it a valuable activity? Was that a valuable activity? I'm not sure. But what I do think, I agree that with most of us, it is a kind of disease. I remember as an awful example, kind of inward collecting. My children once persuaded me to start collecting car numbers. numbers. The idea was that you started at 990, you found a card with 999 on it, and then you found a card with 998 and a card 997. This was the beginning of something like 6 months of absolute pure hell, because you cannot, once you start, you cannot detach yourself. I think in all collecting there is an obsessiveness which in the end, as Matthew says, in a probably fundamentally unhealthy way, takes over.
Yes,
No,
absolutely.
it's
And like-
acceptable.
Yes, and I agree absolutely. And I was going to mention, I mean, train spotting in exactly the same sort of, which all exists out there. It's a peculiar sort of, it's a private thing. And yet there is a uniform, as we know. We've seen train spotters, we know what they wear. But I mean, it's a private activity. But even more private than that, you sometimes find people who have been collecting, but it's all been completely secret. So this sort of display element of the collection doesn't come into it at all. What's going on there? An old elderly relative of my husband's, when she passed on, obviously the effects had to be gone through, and we found drawers and drawers of the most wonderful silk and satin underwear. I mean, beautiful. I'm talking very expensive, with wonderful Brussels lace. And this was rather a stern old lady in a hearty cast iron corset, but all kept in tissue paper and lavender bags, never to be seen by anybody, and I'm sure never worn.
No, but I
What's
think
going
this
on
is
there?
very unfair. I think collecting is the acceptable side of mental illness, of boringness.
Well, isn't every side of mental illness
Because,
acceptable?
I mean, the opposite of collecting galvanised watering cans or things is to talk to people about them. That would be absolutely unbearable. Collection is a private relationship between your obsessions and some objects that happen to engage them.
A solitary vice.
And if you like, what's wrong with that? And you see, I think it's all based on what Edward was saying about the OXO tin, that somehow when we see things that remind us of our past, we have this strange feeling that they're important because they mean something to us. And the collection seems to be a harmless and almost enviable way in which you put the
But
feeling
don't
of
you
your own
think some
nostalgia into
people-
some sort of feeling of importance.
But don't you think some people carry it to the lengths where they, as it were, climb into their collections, just as some people climb into their beliefs? However, I was speaking about the completeness thing. I think that the fear of that can be carried to extremes. And I remember a friend of mine looked up at his bookshelves and felt that he was looking at a complete version of himself. He felt he was looking at a kind of memorial to himself before he had actually entered the grave. And he sold all his books in the middle of his life, as it were, and started again. Now, I think there was a touch of mania in that.
Yes, I feel a bit of a hypocrite about this because as a congenital diarist, I've kept a diary for 60 years. Am I a collector of days? I'm
You
a collector
are.
of time.
You
I'm
are.
So there is a kind. I'm a hypocrite. I resign, but not entirely. I think sometimes collections are made because it is a gentlemanly thing to have a collection. I remember my Uncle Charlie used to collect French miniatures, and I remember once standing in the room in which he had these French miniatures.
French minister.
Oh, sorry, this is recent news that has affected my... He had all these French ministers and prime ministers, and he said, "This is the room your father had the damn cheek to call my bloody museum." And I remember his son, a cousin of mine, at the age of 13 or 14, was sent to London to stay with us. And every day he received instructions from the collector saying, "Go today to the Victorian Albert, look at the French miniatures. And next day, go to the Courtauld and look at the miniatures." And one day I stood with him at the tram stop. We were going off to, goodness knows where. And he looked so dismal. I said, "Is there something wrong?" And he said, "Damned collections, damned French miniatures, ministers." And so I said, "Where would you like to go?" And he said, "Madame Tussauds." And so we went to Madame Tussauds.
But surely the very worst manifestation of this, I'm sure we must all have come across those cruiser class hostesses who actually say things like, "Oh, but I collect people." And of course this is the worst possible thing, because they really do. These people really do collect people, and you are just there for your little piece in the mosaic. Of
I just want to say, as we end, that I knew a man, and none of this is a fib, who weighed 22 stone and collected toy soldiers. And as he was delivering my wife of our second child, I looked at his red braces and I thought, is it his being a gynecologist or a collector of toy soldiers that makes him peculiar? And I could not make up my mind.
Sarah Harrison, Nicholas Tucker, Matthew Parris and Edward Blishen were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Mervyn Stutter provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Claire Brennan.
And Robert Robinson will be back to stop the week next Saturday at 10 to 7.